The La Crosse Community Theater and AM 1410 WIZM present H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror, adapted by Todd Wohlert, performed in the Liquid Lounge at the studios of Midwest Family Broadcasting. Sponsored by Gerhard's First Supply Showroom, Optical Fashions, and Firefighters Credit Union. Come with us now. Through the power of imagination, travel back in history. Hear our story, the story of the Dunwich Horror.
When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of Aylesbury Pike, just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible, and since a certain season of horror, all the signboards pointing towards it have been taken down. 2 centuries ago, when talk of witch blood, Satan worship, and strange forest presences was not laughed at, it was the custom to give reasons for avoiding the locality. In our sensible age, since the Dunwich Horror of 1928 was hushed up by those who had the town's and the world's welfare at heart, people shun it without knowing exactly why. Other traditions tell of foul odors near the hill-crowning circles of stone pillars, and of rushing, airy presences to be heard faintly at certain hours from stated points at the bottom of the great ravines, while still others try to explain the Devil's Hop Yard, a bleak, blasted hillside where no tree, shrub, or grass blade will grow. These tales, of course, are obsolete and ridiculous, because they come down from very old times. Dunwich is indeed ridiculously old, older by far than any of the communities within 30 miles of it. Oldest of all are the great rings of rough-hewn stone columns on the hilltops. But these are more generally attributed to the Indians than to the settlers. Deposits of skulls and bones found within these circles, and around the sizable table-like rock on Sentinel Hill, sustain the popular belief that such spots were once the burial places for the Pocahontas. Even though many ethnologists, disregarding this absurd probability of such a theory, persist in believing the remains Caucasian. It was in the township of Dunwich, in a large and partly inhabited farmhouse set against the hillside, 4 miles from the village and 1.5 miles from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whately was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1913. This date was recalled because it was Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that the mother was one of the decadent Whatleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half-insane father about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Lavinia Whately had no known husband, but according to the custom of the region, made no attempt to disavow the child, concerning the other side of whose ancestry the country folk might, and did, speculate as widely as they chose. On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pink-eyed albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about its unusual powers and tremendous future. Lavinia was a lone creature given to wandering amidst thunderstorms in the hills and trying to read the great odorous books which her father had inherited through 2 centuries of Whatleys, and which were fast falling to pieces with age and wormholes. She had never been to school, but was filled with disjointed scraps of ancient lore that old Whately had taught her. The remote farmhouse had always been feared because of old Whately's reputation for black magic, and the unexplained death by violence of Mrs. Whately when Lavinia was 12 years old had not helped to make the place popular. No known doctor or midwife presided at Wilbur's birth. Neighbors knew nothing of him till a week afterward, when old Whately drove his sleigh through the snow into Dunwich village and discoursed incoherently to the group of loungers at Osborne's general store.
I don't care what the folks think. If Lavinia's boy looked like his pa, he wouldn't look like nothing like you expect. You needn't think the only folks is the folks hereabouts. Let me tell you something. Someday you'll hear folks and child of Lavinia's a calling his father's name on top of Sentinel Hill.
The only person who saw Wilbur during the first month of his life were old Zechariah Whately, of the undecayed Whatleys, who came to lead a pair of Alderney cows which old Whately had bought of his son Curtis. This marked the beginning of a course of cattle buying on the part of small Wilbur's family, which ended only in 1928 when the Dunwich Horror had come and gone. Yet at no time did the ramshackle Whatley barn seem overcrowded with livestock. There came a period when people were curious enough to steal up and count the herd that grazed precariously on the steep hillside above the farmhouse, but they could never find more than 10 or 12 anemic, bloodless-looking specimens. Odd wounds or sores, having something of the aspect of incisions, seemed to affect the visible cattle. And once or twice during the earlier months, certain callers fancied they could discern similar sores about the throats of the gray, unshaven old man and his slatternly, crinkly-haired albino daughter. In the spring after Wilbur's birth, Lavinia resumed her customary rambles in the hills, bearing in her misproportioned arms the swarthy child. Public interest in the Whatleys subsided after most of the country folk had seen the baby, and no one bothered to comment on the swift development which that newcomer seemed every day to exhibit. Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal, for within 3 months of his birth, he attained a size and muscular power not usually found in infants under a full year of age. His motions and even his vocal sounds showed a restraint and deliberateness highly peculiar in an infant, and no one was really unprepared when, at 7 months, he began to walk unassisted, with falterings which another month was sufficient to remove. The next January, gossips were mildly interested in the fact that Lavinia's black brat had commenced to talk, and at the age of only 11 months. The boy was not talkative, yet when he spoke, he seemed to reflect some elusive element wholly unpossessed by Dunwich and its denizens. The strangeness did not reside in what he said, or even in the simple idioms he used, but seemed vaguely linked with his intonation or with the internal organs that produced the spoken sounds. His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his mother's and grandfather's chinlessness, his firm and precariously shaped nose united with the expression of his large dark eyes to give him an air of quasi-adulthood and well-nigh preternatural intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly, despite his appearance of brilliancy, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large-pored yellowish skin, coarse, crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. He was soon disliked even more decidedly than his mother and grandsire, and dogs abhorred the boy, and he was always obliged to take various defensive measures against their barking menace. Meanwhile, old Whatley continued to buy cattle without measurably increasing the size of his herd. He also cut timber and began to repair the unused parts of his house, a spacious, peak-roofed affair whose rear end was buried entirely in the rocky hillside, and whose 3 least-ruined ground-floor rooms had always been sufficient for himself and his daughter. There must have been prodigious reserves of strength in the old man to enable him to accomplish so much hard labor, and though he still babbled dementedly at times, his carpentry seemed to show the effects of sound calculation. It had already begun as soon as Wilbur was born, when one of the many tool sheds had been put suddenly in order, clapboarded and fitted with a stout, fresh lock. Now, in restoring the abandoned upper story of the house, he was no less thorough a craftsman. His mania showed itself only in his tight boarding up of all the windows in the reclaimed section, though many declared that it was a crazy thing to bother with the reclamation at all. Less inexplicable was his fitting up of another downstairs room for his new grandson, a room which several callers saw, though no one was ever admitted to the closely boarded upper story. This chamber he lined with tall, firm shelving, along which he began gradually to arrange, in apparently careful order, all the rotting ancient books and parts of books, which during his own day had been heaped promiscuously in odd corners of the various rooms.
I made some use of them, but the boy's fitting to make better use of them. He'd ought to have 'em as well so's he can, for they're going to be all of his learning.
When Wilbur was a year and 7 months old, in September 1914, his size and accomplishments were almost alarming. He had grown to as large as a child of 4, and was a fluent and incredibly intelligent talker. He ran freely about the fields and hills and accompanied his mother on all her wanderings. At home, he would pore diligently over the queer pictures and charts in his grandfather's books, while old Whatley would instruct and catechize him through long, hushed afternoons. By this time, the restoration of the house was finished, and those who watched it wondered why one of the upper windows had been made into a solid plank door. It was a window in the rear of the east gable end, close against the hill, and no one could imagine why a cleated wooden runway was built up to it from the ground. About the period of this work's completion, people noticed that the old tool house, tightly locked and windowlessly clapboarded since Wilbur's birth, had been abandoned again. The door swung listlessly open, and when Earl Sawyer once stepped within after a cattle-selling call on Old Whatley, he was quite discomposed by the singular odor he encountered. Such a stench, he averred, as he had never before smelt in all his life, and which could not have come from anything sane or of this earth. It had for some time been noticed that dogs had begun to hate and fear the whole Whatley place as violently as they hated and feared young Wilbur personally.
We will continue the Dunwich Horror after these messages on 1410 WIZM.
A lot of things go into a credit score, but there's more things that go into a human being. The money man Bruce Mullock, president of Firefighters Credit Union, doesn't judge you solely on your credit score. He looks at who you really are. Talk to someone who will really listen. Talk to Bruce at Firefighters Credit Union. Let the money man make your life a lot easier. Firefighters Credit Union has 2 convenient locations in La Crosse on 5th Avenue and in Holman on Amy Drive. An equal housing lender.
It's eerie, spooky, sometimes downright scary. Ah! It's your kitchen! Creaking cabinets, scary countertops, that dripping faucet. Your kitchen is the gathering place in your home, but the way it looks right now, you wouldn't be caught dead there. Bring your kitchen back to life with Gerhardt's First Supply Showroom. Gerhardt's kitchen design specialists can help you customize your kitchen to fit the way you use a kitchen. Gerhardt's First Supply Showroom, because life happens in your kitchen.
My creature's eyes don't work. He can't see clearly. It's time to go to the cemetery again and collect some fresh specimens.
We don't need to go that far. We just need to go to Optical Fashions.
They have eyes to spare?
No! They have doctors who give complete eye exams and work with you to help correct your vision problems. Plus, we can find your creature some really nice frames to wear. Make them look a little less scary.
That's a great idea. I could use some new frames myself. People tell me these make me look like a mad scientist.
Optical Fashions on Highway 16. Look for the 3 terracotta beaks.
We now take you back to H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror on 1410 WIZM.
About 1923, when Wilbur was a boy of 10, whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave all the impressions of maturity, a second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house. It was all inside the sealed upper part, and from bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out all the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the peaked roof. In the spring after this event, old Whatley noticed the growing number of whippoorwills that would come out of Cold Spring Glen to chirp under his window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance, and told the loungers at Osborne's that he thought his time had almost come.
They whistled just now in tune with my breathing now, and I guess they're getting ready to catch my soul. They know it's a-going out and don't calculate to miss it. You'll know, boys, after I'm gone, whether they get me or not. If they do, they'll keep us singing and laughing till break of day. If they don't, they'll kind of quiet down like. I expect them and the souls they hunts for have some pretty tough tussles sometimes.
On Lammas night, 1924, Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury was hastily summoned by Wilbur Whatley, who lashed his one remaining horse through the darkness and telephoned from Osborne's in the village. He found old Whatley in a very grave state with a cardiac action and stertorous breathing that told of an end not far off. The shapeless albino daughter and oddly bearded grandson stood by the bedside, whilst from the vacant abyss overhead there came a disquieting suggestion of rhythmical surging or lapping, as of the waves on some level beach. Towards 1 o'clock, old Whatley gained consciousness.
More space, Willie. More space soon. You grows and that grows faster. It'll be ready to serve you soon, boy. Open up the gates to Yog Sothoth with the long chant you'll find on page 751 of the complete edition. And then put a match to the prison. Fire from earth can't burn it nohow. Eat it regular, Willie. And mind the quantity, but don't let it grow too fast for the place. For if it busts quarters or gets about afore ye opens to Yarg Sothoth, it'll all over and no use. Only them from beyond can make it multiply and work. Only them, the old uns, as wants to come back.
When the final throaty rattle came, Dr. Houghton drew shrunken lids over the glazing gray eyes as this tumult of whippoorwills faded imperceptibly to silence.
They didn't give them.
Wilbur was by this time a scholar of really tremendous erudition in his one-sided way, and was quietly known by correspondence to many librarians in distant places where rare and forbidden books of old days are kept. In 1925, when a scholarly correspondent, Dr. Armitage, from Miskatonic University, called upon him one day and departed pale and puzzled. He was fully 6 3/4 feet tall. Through all the years, Wilbur had treated his half-deformed albino mother with a growing contempt, finally forbidding her to go to the hills with him on May Eve and Hallowmass. And in 1926, the poor creature complained to Mamie Bishop of being afraid of him.
There's more about him as I can tell you, Mamie. Nowadays, there's more than what I know myself. I vow for God, I don't know what he wants, nor what he's a-trying to do.
That Halloween, the hill noises sounded louder than ever, and the fire burned on Sentinel Hill as usual, but people paid more attention to the rhythmical screaming of vast flocks of unnaturally belated whippoorwills, which seemed to be assembled near the unlighted Watley farmhouse. After midnight, their shrill notes burst into a kind of pandemonic cachinnation, which filled all the countryside, and not until dawn did they finally quiet down. Then they vanished, hurrying southward where they were fully a month overdue. What this meant, no one could quite be certain till later. None of the country folk seemed to have died, but poor Lavinia Watley, the twisted albino, was never seen again. In the summer of 1927, Wilbur repaired 2 sheds in the farmyard, and began moving his books and effects out to them. Soon afterwards, Earl Sawyer told the loungers at Osborne's that more carpentry was going on in the Watley farmhouse. Wilbur was closing all the doors and windows on the ground floor, and seemed to be taking out partitions, as he and his grandfather had done upstairs 4 years before. He was living in one of the sheds, and Sawyer thought he seemed unusually worried and tremulous. His height had increased to more than 7 feet and showed no signs of ceasing its development. The following winter brought an event no less strange than Wilbur's first trip outside the Dunwich region. Correspondence with the library of Miskatonic University at Arkham had failed to get him the loan of a book he desperately wanted. So at length, he set out in person to consult the copy at Miskatonic, which was the nearest to him geographically. Almost 8 feet tall, and carrying a cheap new valise from Osborne's general store, this dark and goatish gargoyle appeared one day in Arkham in quest of the dreaded volume kept under lock and key at the college library, the hideous Necronomicon. He had never seen a city before, but had no thought save to find his way to the university grounds, where indeed he passed heedlessly by the great white fanged watchdog that barked with a natural fury and enmity and tugged frantically at its stout chain. Wilbur had with him the priceless but imperfect copy of Dr. Dee's English version, which his grandfather had bequeathed him, and upon receiving access to the Latin copy, he at once began to collate the 2 texts with the aim of discovering a certain passage, which would have come on the 751st page of his own defective volume. This much he could not civilly refrain from telling the librarian, the same erudite Henry Armitage, who had once called at the farm, and who now politely plied him with questions. He was looking for a kind of formula or incantation containing the frightful name Yarg Sothoth, and it puzzled him to find discrepancies, duplications, and ambiguities, which made the matter of determination far from easy. As he copied the formula he finally chose, Dr. Armitage, the librarian, looked involuntarily over his shoulder at the open pages, the left-hand one of which, in the Latin version, contained such monstrous threats to the peace and sanity of the world.
The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be. Not in the spaces we know, but between them. They walk serene and primal, undimensioned and to us unseen. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth. He knows where the old ones broke through of old, and where they shall break through again. By their smell can men sometimes know them near, but of their semblance can no man know, saving only in the features of those they have begotten on mankind. And of those are there many sorts, differing in likeness from man's truest eidolon to the shape without sight or substance, which is them. They walk unseen and foul in lonely places where the words have been spoken and the rites howled through at their seasons. The wind gibbers with their voices, and the earth mutters with their consciousness. They bend the forest and crush the city, yet may not forest or city behold the hand that smites. Great Kulu is their cousin, yet can he spy them only dimly. Aye, Shub-Niggurath, as a foulness shall ye know them. Their hand is at your throats, yet ye see them not, and their habitation is even one with your guarded threshold. Yog-Sothoth is the key to the gate whereby the spheres meet. Man rules now where they ruled once. They shall soon rule where man rules now. They wait patient and potent, for here shall they reign again.
Mr. Armitage, I calculate I've got to take that book home. There's things in it I've got to, under certain conditions, that I can't get here, and it ought to be a mortal sin to let a red tape rule hold me up. I don't need to tell you, I'll take good care of it.
Armitage thought suddenly of the possible consequences and checked himself. Whatley saw how things stood.
Well, all right. If ye feel that way about it, maybe Harvard won't be so fussy as you be.
And without saying more, he rose and strode out of the building, stooping at each doorway. Armitage heard the savage yelping of the great watchdog and steadied Whatley's gorilla-like lope as he crossed the bit of campus visible from the window. He locked away the Necronomicon with a shudder of disgust, but the room still reeked with an unholy and undefinable stench.
As of foulness shall ye know them.
Yes, the odor was the same as that which had sickened him at the Whatley farmhouse less than 3 years before.
What thing, what cursed, shapeless influence on or off this three-dimensional earth was Wilbur Whatley's father? What horror fastened itself on the world in half-human flesh and blood?
Early in August, in the small hours of the 3rd, Dr. Armitage was awakened suddenly by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdog on the college campus. As he approached the library, Armitage saw that others were ahead of him. An open window showed black and gaping in the moonlight. Armitage brushed back the crowd as he unlocked the vestibule door. Among the others, he saw Professor Warren Rice and Dr. Francis Morgan, men to whom he had told some of his conjectures and misgivings, and these two he motioned to accompany him inside. The thing that lay half bent on its side in a fetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall, and the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. Near the central desk, a revolver had fallen, a dented but undischarged cartridge later explaining why it had not been fired. The thing itself, however, crowded out all other images at the time. It was hardly human beyond a doubt, with very man-like hands and head, and the goatish, chinless face had the stamp of the Whatleys upon it. But the torso and lower parts of the body were teratologically fabulous, so that only generous clothing could ever have enabled it to walk on earth unchallenged or uneradicated. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black and dimly suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, the skin was thickly covered with coarse, black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long, greenish-gray tentacles with red, sucking mouths protruded limply. On each of the hips, deep set in a kind of pinkish, ciliated orbit was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye, whilst in lieu of a tail there depended a kind of trunk or feeler with purple annular markings, and with many evidences of being an undeveloped mouth or throat. The limbs, save for their black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of prehistoric Earth's giant saurians, and terminated in ridgy, veined pads that were neither hooves nor claws. When the thing breathed, its tail and tentacles rhythmically changed color, as if from some circulatory cause normal to the non-human greenish tinge, whilst in the tail it was manifest as a yellowish appearance, which alternated with a sickly grayish-white in the spaces between the purple rings. As the presence of the three men seemed to rouse the dying thing, it began to mumble without turning or raising its head. At first, the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of Earth, but towards the last there came some disjointed fragments, evidently taken from the Necronomicon, that monstrous blasphemy in quest of which the thing had perished. A change came over the yellow, goatish face of the prostrate thing, and the great black eyes fell in appallingly. Dr. Armitage shouted to the men outside that no one must be admitted till the medical examiner came or the police. Meanwhile, frightful changes were taking place on the floor. Aside from the external appearance of face and hands, the really human element in Wilbur Whatley must have been very small. When the medical examiner came, there was only a sticky whitish mass on the painted boards, and the monstrous odor had nearly disappeared. Apparently, Whatley had had no skull or bony skeleton, at least in any true or stable sense. He had taken somewhat after his unknown father.
We will continue the Dunwich Horror after these messages on 1410 WIZM.
News Talk 1410 WIZM. La Crosse's first radio station is proud to be the exclusive news talk station for the La Crosse area and beyond. Get national news from CBS News and spend the day with nationally known talk show hosts like Sean Hannity.
You're a great American.
And Rush Limbaugh.
Talent on loan from God.
Start and end your day with local hosts Mitch Reynolds and Mike Hayes.
Please, hug your kids.
Plus, hear commentary from Scott Robert Shaw.
As I see it.
And Brad Williams.
What's on Brad's desk?
All these personalities and much more. News Talk 1410 WIZM.
The La Crosse Community Theater has another fantastic season underway with great shows sure to entertain. Currently, the musical mystery Something's Afoot is playing to packed houses. Next, just in time for the Christmas season, is the holiday classic Yes, Virginia, There Is a Santa Claus. Following this is the spiritually uplifting musical Godspell in January and February. Then in March and April, the La Crosse Community Theater features the Bard of Avon himself, William Shakespeare, and his comedy, Twelfth Night. In May, it's Mel Brooks' multiple award-winning musical comedy extravaganza, The Producers. Wrapping up the season, it's the children's variety show Masquerade in June. To get tickets for all or one of these shows, call the box office at 608-784-9292. The La Crosse Community Theater, celebrating 45 years of life on stage.
We now take you back to H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror on 1410 WIZM.
It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had been very pronounced during the evening, and dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's, rushed frenziedly back from his morning trip with the cows.
Up there on the road, beyond the glen. There's something been there. It smells like thunder, and all the bushes and little trees is pushed back from the road like a house been moved along, and that ain't the worst neither. The prints in the road, Miss Corey. Great round prints as big as barrelheads, all sunk down deep like an elephant and been along. Only they's a sight more than no 4 feet could make. I looked at 1 or 2 of them afore a run, and I could see every one of them was covered with lines spreading out from one place like as if big palm leaf fans twice or 3 times as big as any as they is had been pounded down into the road. And the smell was awful, like what was on around old Wizard Watley's house.
Mrs. Corey, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors. When she got Sally Sawyer, it became her turn to listen instead of transmit, for Sally's boy Chauncey had been up on the hill towards Watley's and had dashed back in terror after one look at the place and at the pasturage where Mr. Bishop's cows had been left out all night.
Yes, Miss Corey. Chancey, he just come back a-postin' and couldn't half talk for being scared. He says old Watley's house is all bowed up with timbers scattered round like they'd been dynamite inside. Only the bottom floor ain't through, but is all covered with a kind of tar-like stuff that smells awful and drips down off'n the edges onto the ground where the side timbers is blowed away. And there's awful kind of marks in the yard. 2 great round marks, bigger round than a hogshead, and all sticky with stuff like is on the broad-up house. Chancey, he says, they leads off into the meadows, where a great swath wider than a barn is matted down, and all the stun walls tumbled every which way wherever it goes. And as how he sought to look for Seth's cows, frightened as he was, and found 'em up in the upper pasture near the Devil's Hop yard, in an awful shape. Half of 'em's clean gone, and nigh half of them that's left is sucked most dry of blood, with sores on 'em like they's been on Watley's cattle ever since Lavinia's black brat was born. This don't mean no good, and I think as all the men folks ought to get a party up and do something.
By that noon, fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between the new-made Watley ruins and Cold Spring Glen, examining in horror the vast, monstrous prints, the maimed bishop cattle, the strange, noisome wreck of the farmhouse, and the bruised, matted vegetation of the fields and roadside. Whatever had burst loose upon the world had assuredly gone down into the great sinister ravine. For all the trees on the banks were bent and broken, and a great avenue had been gouged in the precipice-hanging underbrush. From below, no sound came, but only a distant, undefinable fetor, and it is not to be wondered at that the men preferred to stay on the edge and argue, rather than descend and beard the unknown horror in its lair. That night everyone went home, and every house and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. About 2 a.m, a frightful stench and the savage barking of the dogs awakened the household at Elmer Fry's, and all agreed that they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping sound from somewhere outside. Mrs. Fry proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree when the noise of splintering wood burst in upon their deliberations. It came apparently from the barn and was quickly followed by a hideous screaming and stamping amongst the cattle. The dogs slavered and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbed family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but knew it would be death to go out into that black farmyard. At last the noise of the cattle subsided to a pitiful moaning, and a great snapping, crashing, and crackling ensued. The Frys huddled together in the sitting room. Selina Fry tottered to the telephone to spread what news she could of the second phase of the horror.
Help! Oh, my God!
And some thought a crashing sound followed the breaking off of the exclamation. There was nothing more. No one dared do anything. In the morning, a hastily assembled group of armed men trudged out to the fry place at the head of the glen. It was horrible, yet hardly a surprise. There were more swaths and monstrous prints, but there was no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amongst the ruins nothing living or dead could be discovered, only a stench and a tarry stickiness. The Elmer Fries had been erased from Dunwich. In the meantime, a quieter yet even more spiritually poignant phase of the horror had been blackly unwinding itself behind the closed door of a shelf-lined room in Arkham. The curious manuscript record or diary of Wilbur Whatley, delivered to Miskatonic University for translation, had caused much worry and bafflement among the experts in language both ancient and modern. It was Armitage's belief that, considering the great amount of text involved, the writer would scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save perhaps in certain special formulae and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the preliminary assumption that the bulk of it was in English. Certain letters, as used in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged definitely and unmistakably, and it became obvious that the text was indeed in English. On the evening of September 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read for the first time a continuous passage of Wilbur Whatley's annals, almost the first long passage that Armitage deciphered. An entry dated November 26, 1916, proved highly startling and disquieting.
Today learned the Aklo for the Sabbath, which did not like it being answerable from the hill and not from the air. That upstairs is more ahead of me than I thought it would be, and it is not like to have much earth brain. They from the air told me at Sabbath that it will be years before I can clear off the earth, and I guess grandfather will be dead then. So I'll have to learn all the angles of the planes and all the formulas between the ear and the nadir. They from outside will help, but they cannot take body without human blood. That upstairs looks like it will have the right cast. I can see it a little when I make the Voorish sign or blow the powder of Iringazi at it. And it is near like them at Maeve on the hill. The other face may wear off some. I wonder how I shall look when the earth is cleared and there are no earth beings on it. He that came with the Aklo Sabbath said that I may be transfigured, there being so much of the outside to work on.
Morning found Dr. Armitage in a cold sweat of terror and a frenzy of wakeful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at his table under the electric light, turning page after page with shaking hands as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text.
But what in God's name can we do?
On the morning of September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while and departed trembling and ashen gray. Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day. He would shout that the world was in danger since the elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and cosmos of matter into some other plane or phase of entity from which it had once fallen, vigintillions of eons ago.
Stop them! Stop them! Those Whatleys meant to let them in, and the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It's a blind business, but I know how to make the powder. It hasn't been fed since the 2nd of August, when Wilbur came here to his death.
Saturday afternoon, Armitage felt able to go over to the library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference. And the rest of that day and evening, the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and the most desperate debate. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from the stack shelves and from secure places of storage, and diagrams and formulae were copied with feverish haste and in bewildering abundance. Late at night, the conference disbanded without having developed a definite plan. But all day Sunday, Armitage was busy comparing formulae and mixing chemicals obtained from the college laboratory. Monday was a repetition of Sunday with Dr. Armitage, for the task in hand required an infinity of research and experiment. Further consultations of the monstrous diary brought about various changes of plan, and he knew that even in the end, a large amount of uncertainty must remain. By Tuesday, he had a definite line of action mapped out and believed he would try a trip to Dunwich within a week. Then on Wednesday, the great shock came. Tucked obscurely away in a corner of the Arkham Advertiser was a facetious little item from the Associated Press, telling what a record-breaking monster the bootleg whiskey of Dunwich had raised up. Armitage, half stunned, could only telephone for Rice and Morgan. Far into the night they discussed, and the next day was a whirlwind of preparation on the part of them all. Armitage knew he would be meddling with terrible powers, yet saw that there was no other way to annul the deeper and more malign meddling which others had done before him. Friday morning, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan set out by motor for Dunwich, arriving at the village about 1 p.m. From the air of hushed fright at Osborne's store, they knew something hideous had happened, and soon learned of the annihilation of the Elmer Fry house and family. Throughout that afternoon, they rode around Dunwich, questioning the natives concerning all that had occurred, and seeing for themselves with rising pangs of horror the drear Fry ruins with their lingering traces of the tarry stickiness, the blasphemous tracks in the Fry yard, the wounded Seth Bishop cattle, and the enormous swaths of disturbed vegetation in various places. The trail up and down Sentinel Hill seemed to Armitage of almost cataclysmic significance, and he looked long at the sinister altar-like stone on the summit. Armitage, now that he had actually come upon the horror and its monstrous work, trembled with the responsibility he felt to be his. The old librarian rehearsed the formulae he had memorized and clutched the paper containing the alternative one he had not memorized. Rice, beside him, took from a valise a metal sprayer of the sort used in combating insects, whilst Morgan uncased the big game rifle on which he relied, despite his colleagues' warnings that no material weapon would be of help. It was still gruesomely dark when a confused babble of voices sounded down the road. Another moment brought to view a frightened group of more than a dozen men, running, shouting, and even whimpering hysterically. Someone in the lead began sobbing out words, and the Arkham men started violently when those words developed a coherent form.
Zabby here was calling folks up, and everyone was a-listening in when a call from Seth Bishop's cut in. His housekeeper, Sally, was a-carrying on fit to kill. She just see the trees a-bending beside the road and says there was a kind of mushy sound, like an elephant puffing and treading, heading for the house. Then she up and spoke sudden of a fearful smell, and says her boy Chancey was a-screaming as how it was just like what he smelt up to the Watley ruins Monday morning, and the dogs was barking and whining awful. And then she let out a terrible yell and says she down the road had just caved in like the storm bed bloated over, only the wind wasn't strong enough to do that. Everybody was a-listening, and we could hear lots of folks on the wire a-gasping. All at once, Sally, she yelled again, and says the front yard picket fence had just crumpled up, though there wasn't no sign of what done it. Then everybody on the line could hear Chancey and old Seth Bishop a-yelling too, and Sally was shrieking about that something heavy had struck the house, not lightning or nothing, but something heavy against the front. It kept launching itself again and again, but you couldn't see nothing out the front windows. And then Sally, she yelled out, "Oh, help, the houses are caving in." And on the wire we could just hear a terrible crashing and a whole flock of screaming, just like when Elmer Fry's place was took, only worse.
And that's all. Not a sound nor squeak over the phone after that, just still like. We that heard it got out Fords and wagons and rounded up as many able-bodied menfolks as we could get at Corey's place, and come up here to see what you thought best to do.
We must follow it, boys. I believe there's a chance of putting out of business this thing. You men know that those Watleys were wizards. Well, this thing is a thing of wizardry, and it must be put down by the same means. Now, I've seen Wilbur Whatley's diary and read some of the strange old books he used to read, and I think I know the right kind of spell to recite to make the thing fade away. It's invisible. I knew it would be, but there's powder in this long-distance sprayer that might make it show up for a second. It's a frightful thing to have alive, but it isn't as bad as what Wilbur would have let in if he'd lived longer. You'll never know what the world escaped. Now, we've only this one thing to fight, and it can't multiply. It can, though, do a lot of harm, so we mustn't hesitate to rid the community of it. We must follow it.
Armitage, with Rice and Morgan, started to walk in the direction indicated, and most of the natives followed slowly. At length they emerged on a muddy road to find the sun coming out. They were a little beyond the Seth Bishop place, but bent trees and hideously unmistakable tracks showed what had passed by. Only a few moments were consumed in surveying the ruins just round the bend. No one cared to remain there amidst the stench and tarry stickiness, but all turned instinctively to the line of horrible prints leading on toward the wrecked Whatley farmhouse and the altar-crowned slopes of Sentinel Hill. Armitage produced a pocket telescope of considerable power and scanned the steep green side of the hill. Then he handed the instrument to Morgan, whose sight was keener. After a moment of gazing, Morgan cried out sharply, passing the glass to Earl Sawyer and indicating a certain spot on the slope with his finger. Sawyer fumbled a while, but eventually focused the lenses with Armitage's aid. When he did so, his cry was less restrained than Morgan's had been.
Oh, God! God almighty! The grass and bushes is a-moving. It's going up, slow-like, creeping. Up to the top this minute, heaven only knows what for.
We will conclude the Dunwich Horror after these messages on 1410 WIZM.
Do you need money to add on to your business or home? Perhaps you're expanding the square footage of your store. Or maybe you're adding a room onto your home to make space for a new family member that just happens to be a large, voracious, multi-tentacled blob. Talk to someone who will really listen to you when you need money. Talk to the money man, Bruce Mullock, president of Firefighters Credit Union. A lot of things go into a credit score, but there's more things that go into a human being. And blobs. Firefighters Credit Union, an equal housing lender.
Do you do a lot of cooking? Host a lot of parties? Gerhardt's First Supply Showroom can design your kitchen for the way you use it, and even provide computer-aided design drawings so you can see what your room will look like before making a decision. Don't put up with a scary kitchen. Bring it back to life. But before you choose your kitchen designer, stop by Gerhardt's on Cameron Avenue by the Blue Bridges for a free estimate. Gerhardt's First Supply Showroom, because life happens in your kitchen.
I've been really having problems seeing lately.
Things a little blurry?
Well, that and a large, smelly, gelatinous monster attacked my house and barn last night, and I couldn't see the darn thing.
You need to go to Optical Fashions. They have doctors who give complete eye exams and work with you to help correct your vision problems.
That'll take care of my vision, but what should I do about my stink?
Bathing usually helps.
Optical Fashions on Highway 16. Look for the 3 terracotta peaks.
We now conclude H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror on 1410 WIZM.
In the end, the 3 men from Arkham, Old white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean youngish Dr. Morgan ascended the mountain alone. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled as its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. Then it was obvious that the pursuers were gaining. Curtis Whatley of the undecayed branch was holding the telescope when the Arkham party detoured radically from the swath. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get to a subordinate peak, which overlooked the swath at a point considerably ahead of where the shrubbery was now bending. This indeed proved to be true, and the party were seen to gain the minor elevation only a short time after the invisible blasphemy had passed it. Then Wesley Corey, who had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer, which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis Whatley snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. Those without the telescope saw only an instant's flash of gray cloud, a cloud about the size of a moderately large building near the top of the mountain.
Oh, great God! That, it's bigger than a barn. It's all made of squirming ropes, all sort of things shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything, with dozens of legs like hogs' heads that half shut up when they step. There's nothing solid about it. It's all like jelly and made of separate wriggling ropes pushed close together. Great bulging eyes all over it. 10 or 20 miles of trunks are sticking out all along the sides. The biggest stovepipes, and all a tossing and opening and shutting. All gray with kind of blue or purple rings. And oh, God in heaven, that half face on top.
Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the 3 figures as standing on the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but at a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising its hands above its head at rhythmic intervals, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstance, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from the distance, as if a loud chant were accompanying the gestures. The whippoorwills were piping wildly and in a singularly curious, irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. The frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetter that seemed about to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance. Green grass and foliage wilted to a curious, sickly yellow-gray, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. Curtis Whatley was only just regaining consciousness when the Arkham men came slowly down the mountain in the beams of a sunlight, once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet, and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those which had reduced the group of natives to a state of cowed quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact.
The thing has gone forever. It has been split up into what it was originally made of and can never exist again. It was like its father, and most of it has gone back to him in some vague realm or dimension outside our material universe. Some vague abyss out of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could ever have called him for a moment on the hills.
There was a brief silence, And in that pause, the scattered senses of poor Curtis Whatley began to knit back into a sort of continuity, so that he put his hands to his head with a moan. Memory seemed to pick itself up where it had left off, and the horror of the sight that had prostrated him burst in upon him again.
Oh my God! That half face! That half face on top of it! That face with the red eyes and crinkly albino hair and no chin, like the Whatleys. It was an octopus, a centipede, spider kind of thing, but there was a half-shaped man's face on top of it. And it looked like Wizard Whatley's. Oh God, it was yards and yards across.
The whole group of natives stared in bewilderment, not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Whatley, who wanderingly remembered ancient things, but who had been silent heretofore, spoke aloud.
15 year gone, I heard old Whatley say as how someday we'd hear a child of Lavini's a-calling its father's name on top of Sentinel Hill.
What was it, anyhow? And however did young Wizard Whatley call it out of the air it come from?
It was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. A kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. There was some of it in Wilbur Whatley himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out a pretty terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Whatleys were so fond of. The beings they were going to let in tangibly to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to this thing we've just sent back, the Whatleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big. But it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like the father than he did.
You have been listening to AM 1410 WIZM's presentation of H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror, adapted by Todd Wohlert, performed in the Liquid Lounge at the studios of Midwest Family Broadcasting, sponsored by Gerhard's First Supply Showroom, Optical Fashions, and Firefighters Credit Union. Tonight's cast featured John Boyle, Stacy Bruemmer, Arla Clemmons, Sam Hotz, Heather Dutcher, E. Elizabeth Pfizer, Dennis Kuhn, Ken Laramie, Nancy Laramie, Patrick Nee, Jason Robertson, and Pete Solberg. Music composed and performed by Ben Koch. Directed and engineered by Todd Springer. Thank you to Alan Ebert, Dick Record, Scott Robert Shaw, Mike Hayes, Lori Portner, and our live studio audience. On behalf of the La Crosse Community Theater and 1410 WIZM, good night and pleasant dreams. Ha 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 ha!